Well, good morning, everyone. Today we have a wonderful, wonderful dear friend and someone who I really want you to hear from. And I welcome Jeremy Taylor, president of the Tyndale Foundation. Jeremy, good morning.
Good morning. Good to be here with you.
Hey, Jeremy, for those who are not familiar with your story, share a little bit about what you do and also a little bit about the Tyndale Foundation.
Sure. Tyndale House Foundation is a grant-making organization. We were founded in 1963, so we've been around for a while. I'm the president of the foundation, and I've been in this role for just over 2 years. The foundation was started to give away royalties and profits from sales of the Living Bible, which was written by Ken Taylor, my grandfather. That was published in 1972 and really changed the world because for the first time, people all over the globe could read the Bible in language that they could easily understand. And what we understand, what we know is that when you can read and understand God's word, that changes everything. So Tyndale House Foundation, since its inception all the way back in 1963, has been totally devoted to making God's word accessible, available, and understandable for everybody, because we believe ultimately that's the most important thing that helps you in your relationship with Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Hey, Jeremy, I mean, for you personally, a lot of times is your grandfather, Ken Taylor, what is the legacy as you look upon the Tyndale Foundation, even your own life? What's the legacy? What's the imprint that he has left on even your life and the foundation?
Well, it's huge. I mean, for one thing, it's a legacy of generosity. My grandparents, Ken and Margaret Taylor, were totally committed to giving their money away because they believed that it had come from the Lord. Like they were publishing the Bible, and that's God's word. So it was God's resources, God's money, and they wanted to use it for the Lord's work. So there's a legacy of generosity. There's a legacy of commitment to international mission. And here at Tyndale, there's just a legacy of good business practices and looking out for employees, trying to create an environment that's healthy and fun to work in, where everyone feels like they're a valuable part of the team and making a significant and important contribution to the work that the organization is doing globally.
Yeah. Speaking about that, this year is just a very, very unique year. And so a lot of times, Jeremy, you guys did a study on the COVID-19 impact on nonprofit organizations. Share with me a little bit about how that came and what you guys looked at.
Sure. Well, yeah, for one thing, yeah, this has been an unusual year to say the least for any number of reasons, but probably primary among them is the global pandemic that we are still dealing with now all these months later. And as Tyndale House Foundation staff and board members began to think about what was going to be the likely outcome of all that was happening, going all the way back to March of this year, just trying to think long-term, what is going to be the ramifications of a global pandemic and then a global economic fallout in the aftermath. We wanted to basically try to assess what's going to be happening to our partners. And we are not researchers. We are not professional statisticians or data analysts, but we're just people who really care deeply about our partners, and we care about the people that we have relationships with financially and non-financially. So we basically wanted to ask 4 things. First of all, what's happening? Second, how are people being affected by what's happening? Third, how are they responding? And then finally, how can we help? So that was the purpose of this survey that we sent out. And you can go to the next slide, Kent. We sent this survey out to over 200 of our active grantees, so organizations serving around the world. And we wanted to just get a sense from them of what are the needs that they're facing and how can we help them address them as we try to be good partners. So we got responses from about 75%, just about 3/4 of the people that we contacted, which we're happy with. And we feel like that means that people were willing to dialogue with us because they understood that this is something that we're all facing together. So the more information we can gather and then distribute, the better it's going to be for everybody. So we did this back in June. And we've been looking at the data and looking at the numbers since then, just trying to get a sense of what's going on and how can we be good partners through this. Next slide. So we got a global response, and you can see on the map here, the darker blue areas are areas where we got more responses from. So, and then the lighter areas are where we did not get as many responses. So we've got some work to do in Greenland, but overall, I'm pretty pleased with the global scope of the response to this survey. And this is kind of just an illustration of the reach that Tyndale House Foundation has around the world as we try to work with people in many different geographical locations and cultural contexts. Next. This is just a quick look at some of the statistics about the organizations that responded to our survey. Pretty evenly split, small, medium, and large, and you can see what the metrics are there just in terms of number of employees. And then the ministry focus. And again, this is an illustration of the kinds of work that Tyndale House Foundation is involved in through our partners. So leadership, discipleship, church planting, Christian publishing, evangelistic work, etc. These are the kinds of work that our partners are engaged in as they are trying to serve others all around the world. Next slide. And this is not going to be a surprise because we've all been dealing with these things, but this is just the specific ways that people have been affected physically. So thinking about things like government restrictions, mask mandates, closing borders, locking down businesses. We went through all this in the US. We experienced this here in the Chicago area and across the country. And so our ministry partners all over the world were dealing with exactly the same things as we were at exactly the same time. Next slide. Here you can see just some of the emotional fallout from the early days of the pandemic. People in every continent were basically experiencing the same kind of emotional response. People were scared. People were experiencing anxiety, and we're still seeing that today, even 8-9 months later, after we've kind of gone through some of the worst of the emotional response, but we're still seeing incredibly high rates of depression, suicide, substance abuse, and other unhealthy ways that people are dealing with a very natural emotional response to a global crisis. So we saw this in Africa, Europe, Asia, people all over the world saying, yeah, we're dealing with very high anxiety in our communities. At the very least, people are sort of less comfortable than usual, but in a lot of cases, there's rampant anxiety that pervades communities. Next slide. So yeah, basically no one and no thing unaffected. And that's really the reality. I mean, all of us were facing this situation where every organization in the world, every business, every church, every individual was essentially having to deal with the same thing at the same time all over the world. So you think that has maybe an effect on the relationship between grant-making organizations and grantees? You think that has an effect on the relationship between pastors and parishioners? You think that has an effect on the relationship between businesses and customers, between governments and citizens? Obviously, yes, it has a huge impact. So what we wanted to do is assess what are some of the ramifications of that impact and what is that going to look like moving forward. Next slide. Here's the financial impact. And this is just a picture, but it gives you a pretty good idea. I mean, just about every nonprofit organization, we work with nonprofits, Christian nonprofit organizations globally. So that was the kind of the extent of our research. But all of the nonprofits that we talked to, pretty much without exception, experienced some kind of a decrease in giving. So that's a decrease in revenue. That means that some had to lay off employees, some had to furlough employees, some had to reassign employees or make major programmatic shifts in their responses and their overall mission strategy. So that has a pretty significant impact. And you're seeing that even now. I was talking to a leader yesterday in Kenya who said that in Nairobi, there's 75% unemployment, up from an average of something like 30 to 40%. I mean, 75% unemployment is huge. Just think about the cultural impact that that's going to have over the next couple of years. So the fact that organizations are struggling financially is not a surprise, but it's a reality that we have to assess and figure out a way to deal with. Next slide. This is just an idea of some of the ways that organizations are responding. So as I said, we wanted to find out what's happening and how are people being affected, but then how are organizations responding to the needs that they observe in the communities around them? So a lot of organizations have made pretty significant shifts in how they are interacting with the people whose needs they're trying to meet. So whether that means pivoting to doing more online work, moving programs online, moving conferences online. We've seen that happen quite a bit this year. Whether that means setting aside some funding to provide emergency support, whether that means shifting strategy. So we work with a publisher in Kenya that ordinarily they're printing and distributing books. So when the pandemic struck and there wasn't a market for books, they shifted to food distribution and used their resources and their facilities to be a hub for distributing food to people in need in the community. So that's just one example of a way that that one organization, but we've seen this happen again and again all over the world, as organizations take stock of the needs that they have surrounding them and then figure out ways to meet those needs, maybe in some different and unanticipated, unexpected ways than usual, but trying to be the hands and feet of Christ to people around them. Next slide. Here are just again some of the kinds of responses that people have done: canceling programs or trying to reduce overhead in a variety of different ways, whether that means laying people off or cutting salaries, terminating in-person training to try to reduce the likelihood of spreading what has turned out to be an extremely contagious disease, transitioning staff to working remotely. And again, this is stuff that all of us have experienced, and particularly back in March, April, May, when we were locked down and working from home and using Zoom for the first time, and just trying to figure out new ways of doing familiar tasks. And that's something that every organization all around the world has had to do. So you've seen a lot of increased creativity and collaboration as people have tried working together in new, different ways. And that's exciting. But at the same time, obviously, that leads to some significant difficulties that organizations have struggled to overcome. Next slide. Here's a look at the employment situation. So a third of the people who responded to our survey have been able to retain their staff, which is great. But about a quarter of them have had to repurpose staff specifically in response to COVID-19 or to facilitate COVID-19 response themselves. And 40% have had to scale down staffing levels. So that's, I mean, this is not a scientifically valid survey because it's a pretty limited response pool, but 40% of our partners have had to reduce staffing. And I think we have actually seen that to be pretty representative globally. And when you think about the fact that most nations in the world don't have PPP loans, most nations in the world, most governments don't have coronavirus stimulus packages. So that means that organizations in other countries, not in the US, have had a disproportionately high effect on them. So again, as we work with organizations primarily outside of the US, that's been something that we've really had to focus on, pay attention to, wrestle with, pray about, and find ways to be good partners for people who are really struggling. Next slide. Economic hardship is probably, I mean, the pandemic is bad and the healthcare crisis is real. And we're still seeing that even today, and even in the US, maybe especially in the US. But the economic aftermath is what we're trying to focus on a little bit more long-term, because everybody understands that even after there's a vaccine, even after the healthcare crisis is over and done, there's still going to be massive economic fallout that's going to continue for years. And this is just an example of some of the specific ways people are anticipating that they're going to be dealing with the economic aftermath. And as a grant-making foundation, we have limited resources. We can't solve the world's financial problems. Even the Gates Foundation can't solve the world's financial problems. Giving away billions of dollars is not an ultimate solution to this economic crisis. What is the solution? I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but basically it's partnerships and it's relationships. So money can help, resources can help, grants can help, and particularly if you are doing that in a context where you have a strong relationship and a good partnership. But ultimately, it's the relationships that are going to be the most impactful long term. So that's what we are trying to focus on as we assess our relationships with our partners around the globe. Next slide. Here you can see areas that organizations are concerned about. So people are concerned about decreased budgets, of course. They're concerned that their programs are going to have to shift. They're worried about their capacity to meet the needs, the growing needs in their communities and beyond. They're thinking about organizational structure. They're interested in staff morale in an atmosphere where you've got lots of layoffs and reduced salaries, people struggling for employment. What are you doing to keep people engaged and focused and on mission? And mission drift then again is something that is a real danger and something that organizational leaders need to be paying attention to. Next slide. So this was a question that we asked, how long do you anticipate it will be before you are fully recovered from the healthcare crisis and then the economic aftermath? And you can see upwards of 15% could be years. 60% of people think it could be up to a year, 6 months to a year or longer. Very few people are looking at, the short term couple of months of struggle and work to get back to normal. Most people are feeling like we're in this for the long haul. So we've got to be making long-term plans, which is challenging when the situation on the ground is changing so rapidly day to day. So that's the tension that everybody's dealing with. We feel like it could be years before there's meaningful recovery, but at the same time, it's hard to make long-term plans. So how you respond to that tension says a lot about the health of the organization and the strength of your relationships with your partners. Next slide. So how can organizations like Tyndale House Foundation help in non-financial ways? Well, one way is through encouraging collaboration. And these are ideas that we got from our respondents. So these aren't necessarily our ideas, although we agree with them, but this is what we have heard from others. So find ways to encourage collaboration, get organizations working together to help one another and help the people that they're trying to serve. Find creative ways to get other people involved. Maybe it's other organizations, maybe it's individuals, people in the community, people who care about what's happening and want what's best for the people around them, and particularly the church. I mean, how do you get the church engaged when churches are dealing with their own reduced giving and reduced resources? How can you as a congregation, how can you as a pastor, as a church leader, as a seminary professor, as somebody who's thinking about the next generation of Christian leaders, how can you get involved to meet the needs of the people around you? And how can organizations come alongside and help you get involved in carrying out the love of Christ and showing that to people around? Providing resources for responding to needs outside of my scope, as every organization is just looking for any way that they can to respond. Sometimes that means radical shifts. And so we want to try to help people understand what that might look like. And then, of course, praying. Probably we should have listed that first, because I think it's the most important thing that any of us can do as we try to be good partners with organizations around the world and with people in our own families, in our own businesses, in our own communities. We got to pray for each other. And it's been very encouraging. And I know that you, Tommy, and many of your partners have seen some pretty cool increases in like global prayer meetings and people using video conferencing technology to pray together across time zones, across cultures. And that's exciting. That's the global church at work. And we're seeing that in new and exciting ways. But it's got to be done locally too and individually. And we've got to be upholding one another before the Lord. Next slide. So what are the considerations? And you can kind of just walk through these pretty quickly. Here are some of the things that we are recommending based on our research and the responses that we've got. First of all, allow for flexibility in grant making. And again, we're a grant making organization, and we were talking with grant recipients from the past couple of years. So that's kind of the focus with which we are looking at this data. But I think there's implications here and things that other kinds of organizations can learn as well. So allow for flexibility in your grant making, allow for flexibility in your planning. We want to encourage people to be flexible in their response, and that means that we need to be flexible in our response and in our preparation for assisting others. So allowing for flexibility as you work with other organizations to help them respond in the most appropriate ways. Partner on new levels. So find new ways of working together. And this comes back to that collaboration idea. How can you work with other people, other organizations to meet the needs that you've identified, to meet the needs that other people have identified? How can you think creatively together about new strategies? How can you come up with some new creative solutions? And how can we basically meet the needs of the people around us by doing things a little bit differently and finding ways to partner with others on new levels, on ways that we're maybe stretching our comfort zone a little bit, but again, being flexible, allowing for others to be flexible, trying to work together to solve a global crisis. Fund new priorities. Again, every organization in the world has had to shift focus to the same thing at the same time. And that means doing some new things in some new ways. And that costs money, and it costs time and emotional energy and bandwidth, internet infrastructure and resources, buildings. I mean, there are ways that we need to be looking for new solutions and new methods for approaching those solutions. So funding some new priorities. Maybe, I gave that example of the little publishing company in Kenya that suddenly was finding themselves helping with food distribution to people who were starving in the community. How can we provide funding for that operation, even though it's not the same thing that we're used to funding from that particular organization? And there are many, many examples like that around the world of people doing different things in different ways, maybe doing some of the same things, but with different methodology. So how can we partner with them? How can we provide some funding or some non-financial resources, time, creativity, emotional investment, prayer, to help people do some new things in some new ways to meet some new needs? And finally, invest locally and globally. So one of the things that we found in talking with other foundations and other funding organizations early on, going all the way back to March and April, is that a lot of foundations in the early days of the pandemic were investing most of their resources in their own local communities. I think that is totally appropriate and wonderful. If you can't be a good neighbor, then you probably have no business being in Christian philanthropy or any other kind of philanthropy. But what we saw is that the needs that exist internationally are even greater than the needs that exist at home. And we've got big needs at home. We've got big needs in our own neighborhoods. We've got big needs here in Chicago. We've got big needs in Nashville, big needs in New York, big needs in LA, big needs in DC. But the needs that exist internationally are arguably even bigger. When you look at the unemployment numbers, when you look at the way that other governments have not been able to respond in the same way that ours has, and ours is not perfect by any means, but at least they're trying to do something. And particularly in areas where there's already dictatorial tendencies, or in some cases outright dictatorships, what you see is that the government response actually increases the fear and anxiety because it's increasing people's needs, increasing people's dependence. So the way that you respond internationally, I think, is absolutely critical, as well as the way that you're responding locally. So that's what we tried to do at Tyndale House Foundation. We We have relationships with people in the Chicago area, and we wanted to be good partners to them. But 95% of our funding this year went internationally because we saw that the international needs, the global needs, are just as significant and in some ways more critical than the needs at home. So we wanted to be good partners at a global level because ultimately we serve a global kingdom and God's mission is for the whole world. So how can we be good partners with what God is already doing around the globe? And how can we help other organizations who are trying to do that same thing, ministering to people in so many different contexts? Okay, and then listen, pray, and act. So part of being a good partner is being a good listener. I've tried to listen more than I talk, and the past few minutes are an exception to that. But basically, I'm trying to ask good questions and then listen to the responses so that I can act in appropriate ways and pray for appropriate things. And I think there's one more slide, Kent, or a series of slides just talking about some cautions. So let me walk through these real quick. First off, be aware of mission drift. If you think back to that slide that showed what people are concerned about, only 8% of organizational leaders expressed that they were concerned about mission drift, but 60% were doing new things in new ways. So that's exciting and useful and important and necessary. But you also have to be really careful because if you're doing all these new things and developing new priorities, you've got to be really, really aware of the possibility that you could start to do those things in ways that do not align with your core mission principles. So being aware of mission drift is incredibly important for organizations. It's incredibly important for funders, for grantees, for churches, for nonprofit organizations, for businesses. This is a real danger that we've got to be careful about. Next is assess the risk. That basically just thinking about the fact that because, there are risks in doing new things under any circumstances, but particularly when you've got a situation where the whole world is focused on the same issue, there are risks involved in trying new things. So you've got to be careful, you got to be wise and smart about it. But at the same time, if you never take risks, then you're never going to achieve any results. So you got to assess the risk. You got to do that cautiously and in an environment of concern, working together, leaders paying attention to the needs that their organizations have, then they're moving forward and confidently basing your decisions on the Lord's guidance and the provision that comes from Him. Ending well, I think, is difficult, but also critically important. And I don't know, maybe this isn't a caution, but something that people need to be aware of. When you think about the fact that 60% of organizations are doing different things and 40% of organizations have had to lay off staff, it is inevitable that some percentage of these organizations are not going to survive. And one thing that we say in philanthropy is nobody wants to be anybody's last grant. In other words, it's kind of not super exciting for most organizational boards to think about giving the last dollars to somebody before they close their doors forever. But maybe it's time to think about some things in new ways. And if there's ways that we can help someone end well and close down in a way that's honoring to God, that provides for their employees, that takes care of the people in their community, that passes off what they were doing to somebody else who can continue the work, then we want to think about ways that we can do that. And maybe it is by being somebody's last grant, or maybe it's by offering consulting services or hooking people up with other partners who might be able to help them or think through the needs that they have as they transition into the last stages of their organization's business. So ending well is not easy, it's not fun, and it leads to some difficult conversations, but I think those are discussions that we need to be at least willing to have with people, because it's critically important to make sure that as organizations are inevitably going to be shutting their doors, that they're doing it in the right way, providing for the people who need care. Okay, I guess that's it. So, Tommy, I look forward to hearing any questions that you have. Again, we feel like this is mostly helpful for grant-making organizations like Tyndale House Foundation, but I do think that there are things that churches and other organizations can learn from this too, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue with other partners.
No, this is great. A couple questions I have for you, Jeremy, is when you're talking with a lot of the nonprofit ministry organizations, are you finding that they're planning 3 months, 6 months, a year? Because usually the 5-year plans are completely out the window. The 1-year plan are out the window. What are you seeing out there?
We're seeing people doing their best to think long-term and react in the immediate short term. So for some organizations, that means jettisoning 5-year plans. For others, like you said, the 1-year plan is touch and go right now because things are changing very rapidly. And the way the world was 1 year ago is completely different from what the situation is today. So as we think about, and coronavirus is not the only crisis that the world is facing. So people in Africa are dealing with this pandemic on top of floods and famines and military crises and coups and militia activity and terrorism. People in different places in the world are focusing on lots of different things. And COVID is just like the latest thing that we have to deal with. So planning long term is difficult, but it's no less important in this context than it ever is. You just have to be nimble and flexible enough to move and respond immediately and change your plans as necessary.
And Jeremy, wouldn't you say a lot of people love to talk about the ministry work, everything like that? Funding is the conversation that people just are uncomfortable talking about. But yet at the same time, one of the lessons that we have to learn during this time is diversifying your revenue stream. You can't depend all on a foundation. You can't depend on a couple of donors. You have to diversify your revenue stream.
Yeah, that's right. And that's going to be critically important for any organization that does rely on donations as their primary revenue stream. So you've got to expand your donor base. But then I think maybe what you're partially alluding to, Tommy, is you've also got to think about finding other ways to increase your revenue as well. So business as mission is a big focus that a lot of people are talking about right now. There was a Luzon meeting in the Philippines last year about that very thing, and others. I mean, there's books about this and lots of other resources. Are there ways that nonprofit organizations can do something differently to actually generate revenue themselves rather than relying exclusively on donations? Are there other people that you need to go to? Are there ways that you can increase your micro donations? Correct. One of the most effective things that my alma mater ever did was send a letter reminding their alumni that 90% of their donations are less than $100 a year. 90% of their donations are less than $100 a year. Before that, I was not giving. After that, I looked at my situation and my wife and I decided, yeah, we could participate at $100 a year, and then that grows over time. But don't discount the importance of those small donations because those add up too.
Yeah. And even I think a lot of times is that you and I talk, you run the foundation, you're president of foundation, even working with foundation, it takes years. And so for those who are sitting here listening into it, that does not mean you listen to Jeremy, look at Tyndale Foundation, fill out an application, and then hope that you're going to get funded that year. It may take years. So you have to diversify your risk level and not put all your eggs in one basket too.
Yeah, that's right. And you also have to really increase your relationships. I really believe, we're a relational grant-making foundation. We are involved in what's called relational philanthropy. So we want to be good partners. We want to come alongside people and not just send a check, but invest in their lives. We want to get to know an organization's leaders. We want to visit and see what you're doing in your context and walk with you through the things that you're facing. So yeah, you got to increase your revenue and diversify your donor stream, but you also have to invest in those relationships. Correct. And just like you said, Tommy, sometimes that's a multiple year long process. And that's hard. It takes work, and it can be frustrating at times. It takes patience, but it's critically important because ultimately the relationships that you have with people around you and really globally, the relationships that you have with others are going to be your lifeline that sustains you.
Yeah. And Jeremy, I consider you guys a major donor. And so a lot of times for those who are sitting down and you have a couple of major donors in your organization, when Jeremy talks about developing those relationships, that does not mean you sit there and call that person all the time and just talk about money. a lot of times, Jeremy, if that is our basis of our relationship, you would just never answer my phone calls. But we have a personal relationship, but I'm also able to sit there and pick your brain. You're connecting me with different people, but I tell you not only the good things, but also the bad things and the struggles that I deal with, because you know for a fact, I'm not going to be perfect. And there are actually legitimate struggles I deal with in my organization.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that none of that would be possible if there wasn't already a relationship in place.
Yeah.
So I frankly can't remember, Tommy, how long you and I have known each other. It's probably been 10 years or more. But there was a long period of getting to know each other, getting to trust one another before any funding takes place. And if that happens in the reverse order, if you send a check first, I mean, that might be helpful in the immediate short term, but then long term, you're going to end up struggling because you don't have that relational foundation to rely on.
There are some foundations or some donors. I did not get my first grant or my first check until 4-5 years in a relationship, because I was a startup. I wasn't an organization that was around for 100 or 30 years. And so I got to continue to really be able to, or even churches continue to really develop my reputation as well too.
Yeah. And, some foundations, in the Christian world, we understand that nobody can do everything by themselves. And Jesus talked about this very thing, that, and Paul in the epistles, we are the body of Christ. And one organization is like a hand, one organization is like an ear, but we all need each other. So there are some foundations that do need to invest in startups. Yeah. There are other foundations who do need to have a relational capacity first before you begin investing financially. So it takes all of us working together and providing for one another, giving good counsel and helping people walk through whatever it is that they're facing, good and bad, challenging, looking at the opportunities, looking at the needs, grieving with one another when we need to, rejoicing with one another when there's something to celebrate. But again, this all comes back to this concept that we're all part of a global body and part of a global church that's interacting with people who need the gospel in different ways according to our capacity and the gifts that we have, working together for God's glory.
And Jeremy, I'm not sure what you think about. Our mutual friend, Bob Dahl from Nuvi Investments, says to me, Tommy, I have all these ministries coming to me asking for a grant. But one of the things that I also want to see is, are they doing their part to control their expenses? And in some sense, actually, that means taking a look at your accounting department, taking a look at your communications or social media. Do you need a full-time person? Can you partner with another organization and split the cost, where that person is doing social media for 3 or 4 organizations or accounting for 3 or 4, versus back in the days when the economy was good and everything like that, you could hire a full-time person, but it's actually looking at different places that you could cut and be more strategic in your expenses.
Yeah, and that's true on both a small and a macro level. So when you invest funds in broken systems without fixing the problems, then you're basically wasting your money. And you see this on a global scale. The UN has spent, and USAID and others have spent billions, maybe trillions of dollars investing in broken systems. And the result is exactly nobody being helped in some of these areas. And the same thing is true on individual organizational levels. If there are major governance problems, if there are major spending problems, if the board and the staff don't have a good understanding of how to effectively and efficiently operate their business or their organization, then you can give them all the money you want to. It's not going to solve their underlying problems, and they're going to end up in exactly the same place they were a year down the road or a couple years down the road. And you're just going to not have as many resources to invest in others. So you've got to, you do have to do due diligence. And Bob understands that, you understand that, and I understand that. Part of what that means is, and again, this comes back to relationships, because if I just come in with money and demand that you make changes depending on what I think your needs are, that's not helpful. That's not a partnership. So I have to come in a context of trust, in an environment where there is a relational foundation, so that I can look with you at your numbers, so that I can assess with you what your needs are and brainstorm with you what are some potential solutions to some of these issues. And then come in with some funding to help with some of those specific needs.
Jeremy, let me circle back to what you were just saying. A lot of times the business's mission, for-profit initiatives that an organization makes, but then you also said in your cautions, be aware of mission drift. Mm-hmm. In the midst of looking at for-profit initiatives, how do you know that you're not drifting away from your mission or versus that this is an idea we should pursue?
Well, there have literally been books written about this question, and it's very complex. But I think a very important principle is you have to know what your mission actually is. So you have to be able to articulate that. That's your reason for existence. You need to know why you do what you do before you can think about how you're going to accomplish it. So you've got to know what your mission is. You've got to rely on trusted advisors. And this is what the purpose of a board is. Thinking about good governance principles, a board is not there to run the day-to-day business of your organization. They're there to provide a foundational structure in which you can accomplish the mission that the Lord has given you, that you're called to. So you got to rely on the counsel of trusted advisors. I think prayer is critically important. Anything that you do, I mean, the Bible says, unless the Lord builds a house, they that labor are doing it in vain. So we've got to rely on God's word. We've got to rely on wise counselors from trusted advisors. We've got to rely on our own intuition to a certain extent, assessing what the needs are and how we can respond to them based on the resources that the Lord has given to us, entrusted to us, being wise stewards, and then take careful assessment and probably regular assessment. And this is part of what the board should be doing, is working with the staff and the organizational leaders to say, okay, let's pause for a minute and look back at the past month, 6 months, a year, and see what have you done differently, what has worked well, where are some potential red flags or yellow flags or danger areas, where do you need to pull back, where do you need to shift focus, but again, keeping at center stage, what is your mission, why are you doing what you're doing, and then you try to figure out how to accomplish it.
Because a lot of times, Jeremy, you'll probably agree with it, is the whole idea of coffee shops is kind of sexy. But that does not mean you sit there and take some of your reserve money and put $100,000 in starting a coffee business that you have no business of starting because you have no experience in coffee. Nor does that mean as a church, you said, wow, we have all of this different space. Let's put $300,000 and retrofit this whole thing. But maybe there are some cost-effective things. Maybe your accounting department is so big that right now things are kind of light. But there are a group of different accounting or small nonprofits that you work with them on helping them with their accounting. And then through that, you make some money. Or there's a refugee ministry in Indonesia where they want to train refugees on career development, but then they partner up with the Silicon Valley company that needed data processing. So then this group helped out with data processing. The group then paid them to do it. And now they're developing professional skills through all that stuff, which is a natural way that allowed you to accomplish your vision.
Yeah, and thinking long term again is difficult but important. And I love the story that you just recently told me, Tommy, about a group in Indonesia that you've been working with that is now self-sustaining, and they're thinking about the future, setting aside some funding, creating a foundation to help meet needs of people in their community. And that is a direct result of investment that other people have made in them. And it's relational investment as well as financial investment. And now they are in a position to turn around and do that same thing for others.
Correct. All right, here's another question that I think I hear a lot of people struggle with that I want to pick your brain on. You mentioned about the importance of collaboration and partnerships. Every time I sit down with a ministry partner, they say, Tommy, we got to find ways to partner together. But when you get into the nitty-gritties, both sides won't budge. Both sides won't agree with everything like that. What are some tips on tangible partnerships that you've seen when two organizations come together? How do you move from let's partner together to let's actually doing something to partner well together?
Well, I think it comes down to humility and the willingness to ask questions and listen more than talk. Everybody has ideas. Everybody has priorities. And by its very nature, a partnership involves giving up some of your own priorities in favor of the other person's. It's like a marriage. and there's sacrifice involved with that, and it's not always easy. And in fact, sometimes it's very, very difficult. But if you're not willing to engage in giving up some of the things that you are holding dear, then you can't work in partnership or collaboration with others. So I think you have to approach it with an attitude of humility. And I mean, think about Micah 6:8, right? What does the Lord require of you? To do justly and love mercy and walk humbly with the Lord. So if you're committed to justice, true biblical justice, not the latest social justice fad, but true biblical justice, if you are committed to acting in a way that is merciful and that is trying to bring out the best in others, treat them with dignity as individuals who are created in the image of God, and you do that in the context of humility, then I think partnership is possible. And even among people who have very strong opinions, and leaders of organizations tend to have strong opinions, and you need them to have strong opinions, but you also need them to be able to work together in an attitude of humility, listening well, asking good questions, and then relying on others and not setting aside all of your own priorities by any means. You have to stand up for what you believe is right, but at the same time, you have to allow that other people might have different opinions. And then how do you work together to move forward, given the fact that you've got different people, different personalities involved? But if you're doing it in an attitude of humility and reliance on the Lord's provision, then I think not only is it possible, but there's some pretty exciting opportunities that exist.
And Jeremy, wouldn't you say a lot of times in the spirit of humility, it's saying, how can I serve my potential partner well? Not only for this one time, but long term. Because in some sense, if you sit there and say, what can I get from that person, that potential partner will get fooled once. You'll never have a partnership ever again with them long term. But if you sit there and say, how can I serve them well? What do they need to do that I can help them accomplish their objective? They'll sit there, and if they reciprocate, now you have a long-term partnership where you're now working together.
Yeah, and not only if you do it wrong, not only will you not have a partnership with them, but you won't have a partnership with anybody in their network either.
Correct.
Because people aren't stupid, and word gets around. So you have to treat each other well. You have to again operate from a position of humility. And humility does not always mean saying that the other person is always right. Sometimes they're not right, and you need to point that out. But yeah, if you don't treat people well, then you're not going to be a good partner. You're not going to be an effective ministry organization, and you're not going to honor the Lord. Yeah. So that's kind of where it starts, right? That's the foundation for everything else, is honor God, honor others, try to love people the way that God wants you to. And when you are really operating from that kind of a spirit of God honoring humility and wanting to do what's best for other people, I mean, that's scriptural. Yeah. So when you are really operating that way, I think the Lord blesses your efforts. And sometimes that means financial success. Yep. Sometimes it doesn't, but sometimes you can be a blessing to others because of the way the Lord has blessed you non-financially. Yep. And whether that's, giving consulting work or just showing up and helping to serve people in a food line or whatever the case may be. Different organizations have different approaches, and that's great. That's good. So whatever the actual on the ground methodology is, if you're doing it from an attitude of service, understanding that your needs are not the most important thing, then I think you're setting yourself up well for long-term partnership.
And Jeremy, wouldn't you say a lot of times partnerships take time? It's not going to come overnight. So find one specific project that you guys can work on. Learn how to communicate with each other. And sometimes it actually does not involve money or donor names or anything like that. Keep that out of the picture. Find one tangible project that you guys can work on together. Get used to each other. Share the cost. Work with each other and see where it goes. And sometimes personalities may be a great fit, but personalities may not be a good fit. But you won't know until you try something tangible.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to ask questions.
Yeah.
So if you need help, ask for help. Don't pretend like you've got everything together if you don't. Don't pretend like you have all the answers, because I guarantee you don't. So ask questions. Ask for assistance. Ask for other people to come alongside you and work with you and partner with you. you are not the only person or the only organization that can be a good partner to others. There are lots of other organizations out there who want to partner with you, because ultimately we all have the same goal in the Christian world. We want to see God's kingdom come on earth. And that means different things in different places at different times. But ultimately, that's what we want. We want to serve others. We want to be the hands and feet of Jesus. We want to show Christ's love to the people around us. We want to see God's kingdom grow. We want to see the church meeting people's needs. We want to see funding for organizations that need funding. We want to see care for people who need care. We want to see clean water in places where people need clean water. I mean, whatever it happens to look like in a particular context, if you ask for other people's opinions, assistance, guidance, partnership, collaboration, then that's when you see people working together across cultural boundaries, across denominational boundaries. And that's what Jesus prayed for, right? Is unity among his people. That's our goal as we try to create partnerships with other organizations. And I think that's something that God will bless as he answers our prayers as we try to be effective in serving him.
And Jeremy, one last question. This goes in terms of what you said. You were part of our 24-hour global church forum. What you just said is important, not only in the U.S., but around the world, isn't it? The world has changed compared to 20 years ago, where we couldn't be in contact. Every single day you talk with someone from another different part of the world. That means we are listening to people in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, in different parts of the world, and learning from them, not just saying, hey, from the West, we know everything, so follow me, listen to me.
Yeah, and when you think about the fact that the epicenter of the global church is changing, arguably has changed, then we need that counsel from other places in the world. We need to be listening to our brothers and sisters from Africa, from Latin America, from Asia, because we don't have all the answers. And we might have more material resources at certain times and in certain contexts, but that's not everything that people need. And so we need to ourselves be seeking advice and counsel from others who really understand what the needs are in their communities, rather than pretending like we have all the answers and can solve all the problems, because guess what? We can't.
Yeah. And the one thing and last thing and for you to comment on is I've seen donors and funders who don't always understand what's going on culturally. They'll go to a city, they'll see the need, and they'll start funding it. But before you do, understand what God is doing in their city. Listen, embed yourself in the culture, ask a lot of different questions. Be a student to exegete the community and say, Lord, what are you doing? Because you've been here way before me. You have a plan way before me. How am I a good student of that city versus just throwing money around and hoping you'll do good with your good intentions?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that's what I appreciate about the work that you do at Resource Global in investing in community leaders to assess the needs in their own community. That's what I appreciate about what you're doing at the Growth Center as you look to train the next generation of Christian leaders who are going to assess those needs in different places all over the world, and ultimately work together with others in partnership for the sake of the gospel to meet people's needs. Because, you know, Deuteronomy said, Jesus said, the poor will always be with you. That's not a fatalistic approach. Look at the rest of the quote. The poor will always be with you. So make sure that you are caring for the widow and the orphan and the people on the margins. So that's what we're trying to do at Tyndale House Foundation. I know that's that you're trying to do through a number of organizations that you're involved with, and your viewers and church leaders and seminary leaders and professors and administrators. People are engaged in this important task of bringing the gospel to the nations for the sake of blessing the whole world, which is what the Lord has been endeavoring to do since Abraham. So we get to be involved in that task. It's a privilege. It's a responsibility. It's something that we don't take lightly. I know you don't take lightly, and none of the people who are watching this interview take lightly. So by God's grace, as we continue working together to accomplish his work for his glory, let's set ourselves to that task and see what the Lord will do through our efforts.
Yeah. And everyone, this is Jeremy Taylor, president of the Tyndale Foundation. Jeremy, I know you're a busy man, so I appreciate your friendship with taking time out to do this.
Yeah, thanks, Tommy. It's really fun to talk through all this with you, and I look forward to working together some more in the future.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think a lot of times this is the third that we had the conversation with Pastor Jackson Crum to talk about how do you fundraise for churches. We then talked with Andrew Ginsberg and Pam Gifford to talk with how do you communicate and fundraise for nonprofit and ministry organizations. And so, look, I mean, we know funding is a huge part. It's an uncomfortable conversation. Some people just don't like doing it, but it is part of your job day in and day out. And so, Jeremy, thanks for taking time out today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We'll talk soon, everyone. And for more information, go to thegrowcenter.com and follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Grow Center Network. Thanks, everyone.